So next, we're going to move into a very dynamic, thought-provoking panel packed with information, and it's creatively titled, "We Can Get There From Here, the Intersection of Transportation, Housing, and Population Growth." I just want to say that this panel was charged with providing you with a very high-level overview of housing, economic growth, and transportation, changes we can expect moving forward. They each have no more than 8 minutes to provide some very brief highlights of their work, and Catherine will moderate a brief dialogue with the panel. I will let you know, I think most of the panelists will be around today if you need to connect with them afterwards. Moderating the panel is Catherine Dimitruk, Executive Director at Northwest Regional Planning Commission, and panelists include Kevin Chu, Executive Director of the Vermont Futures Project, Alex Farrell, Commissioner of Housing and Community Development at the State of Vermont, Taylor Newton, Planning Program Director at the CCRPC, and Matthew Arancio, Regional Planning Manager at Vermont's Agency of Transportation. All their bios can be found on the QR code on the back of your badge, and I'm going to turn it right over to Catherine to move into the panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sandy. I'm really excited to be here today and to be able to moderate this great panel where you're going to hear about how we get here, how we achieve the vision, the dreams that many of you thought about today. We're going to hear from all of the panelists, and then I'll be asking them a few questions to share some additional thoughts. And as Sandy said, everyone will be around throughout the day so that we can catch up later and have more detailed conversations. So first, I'm very excited to introduce Kevin Chu and ask him to let us know his thoughts. Thanks, Kevin.
Thank you so much. I just want to start by saying thank you again to the Myrnovator specifically. We've been talking about moving people, right? And there's more than one ways to move people. There's the physical movement, but then there's also the emotional and spiritual movement. And every time I see you speak, you move me. I'm inspired. Thank you. Yeah. So I've been asked to help set the stage to answer why. Why more houses? Why do we need to invest in transportation, infrastructure, and capacity? I stood in this very spot at the beginning of this year in January at the Vermont Economic Conference to launch the Economic Action Plan. This is work that the Futures Project has been putting together for the better part of 2 years. I had the opportunity to travel around the state and speak with Vermonters from all 14 counties, over 5,000 people in total. And this plan not only represents the quantitative research that helps us set actionable targets, but also the hopes, dreams, and ambitions of Vermonters for where they want to be in the future. It not only identifies the challenges and barriers we face, but also has recommendations for how we move forward productively. And the future that Vermonters are asking for is one of affordability and abundance. What do I mean by that? Well, the plan helps to connect the dots. We hear about the symptoms all the time. These are the headlines. These are the conversations we're having with our friends and neighbors. Things like workforce shortages, housing scarcity, healthcare, education, transportation, childcare, the affordability challenges. The Economic Action Plan takes a step back and says, okay, with these symptoms, can we identify and start to address some of the root causes? So the pillars of the plan are built on people and places, specifically demographics and housing scarcity. I'll focus my comments on the demographic side of this, since we'll hear from Commissioner Farrell a lot about the housing piece of it. But transportation is what connects people and places and opportunity. So with that, let's set the stage with some data. This is Vermont's age distribution from the year 2000. Now, my least favorite part about presenting this slide is admitting that 2000 was 25 years ago, but that's just a fact. And what we can see from this chart is that Vermont had a relatively large working age population compared to the number of elderly and the number of children in our state. There were about 226,000 Vermonters between the ages of 25 to 49 in that year, and about 77,500 in the 65 plus age category. Now, when we take a look at the picture today, it looks very different. Vermont has almost 30,000 fewer in that 25 to 49 age range, and the 65 plus population has nearly doubled. We have fewer children today, too. So we have a shrinking workforce age population. That means a shrinking tax base. Those are folks that pay into commercial health insurance, right? And then the needs of the overall population have changed. The needs have increased. Healthcare generally increases as people get older. Transportation needs change as people get older. Housing needs change as well. We've mentioned single occupancy vehicles today. We have a lot of single occupancy homes around the state. Median household size has decreased. So for the same population size, as those needs evolve, right, the demand on the systems and structures also evolve. Maybe we need to coin a term, HDM, housing demand management. So with this knowledge, let's take a look at how demographics impacts labor force and the overall economy. When we overlay the population and labor force data on top of each other, here's what we see. Most working age people are participating in the labor force. Where we need to make some progress is adding to the working age population. So green is the number of labor force participants within an age cohort. The blue bar behind it is the total population. And it's a very unbalanced chart. Right, so what are the possible strategies? And in the economic plan, we highlight efficiency strategies. How do we do more with what we have? But we also need expansion strategies. They can happen simultaneously. They need to happen simultaneously. I'll use a sports metaphor here because it's often how I understand data best. I think of this as Team Vermont. Let's pretend we're a college sports team. And we have a lot of seniors who will be graduating from our workforce soon, retiring, and we haven't done enough to recruit the next class of freshmen or transfer sophomores from other states. All right, I think it's amazing that we have a Division I national championship soccer team here at UVM, and I know that they're already recruiting for the next class of talent because that's how you sustain team success over time. So this is just a snapshot. What do things look like going forward? Well, on an annual basis, Vermont needs to be adding about 13,500 people into its workforce. Again, some of that can come from folks who are already here rejoining the workforce, if we can remove some of the barriers that they face, transportation being one of them. But we also need folks from elsewhere coming here too, because there's about 17,150 people retiring from our workforce each year. Again, demographics. And to contextualize that, we have about 5,300 12th grade students in the entire state of Vermont, right? Those two numbers don't balance out. So with this number, we started to take a look at what does Vermont look like in 10, 15 years, and how many people would we need to add to close this gap? And that's how we landed on 802,000 by 2035. Not just because of the area code, yes. Now you'll remember it, it's catchy, and it doesn't even threaten the fact that we could probably still operate with one area code. But the numbers started to get in the 800,000 range, and once a teacher, always a teacher. This is the educational psychology of it. 800,000 sounds really big and scary in a Vermont context, but 802 for some reason is more comfortable and familiar, and people take pride in it. And if you're wondering what that picture is in the background, that's from the solar eclipse. We had an estimated over 150,000 visitors to the state of Vermont that day. So on that one day, we actually had over 800,000 people in Vermont, and we didn't break. We're still here. So it's possible. How we get there from here won't be a single day event, right? It's going to be incremental. It has to be. This is what Vermont's historical growth looks like. And you can see we had a relatively healthy rate of growth until the past 2 decades. And we are living through unprecedented times. At least that's what the data say. The stagnation of the past 20 years is what's creating the demographic pressures we're facing today. And I want us all to think and hold this principle as we move forward about how economic growth and environmental sustainability are often pitted against each other as if only one can win and the other has to lose, but we have to dispel that myth. How we get there matters. And if we do it right, we can both grow the economy, grow the population, grow the number of houses, and do so in a way that improves sustainability and resilience, right? We have been using language like protect from, because we're scared of the possible risks or downsides of growth. We have to shift that to have a more benefits-oriented conversation. We may even need to incentivize growth, use a carrot and not a stick. We've been living through economic stick season for the past 2 decades, and I suggest we try something a little bit different. Yes, that is NOAACon. So I'll hand it over to Commissioner Farrell now, and I just want to leave you with this Venn diagram as a decision-making tool. We are here, the intersection of the blue and the green circles, where we have low population density, and we want to provide ample services. We want to take care of our neighbors. We want to have all these great things that make our communities vibrant. And the result is high cost of living. Again, this is the thing that Vermonters keep bringing up time and again as the challenge that they're facing now. So how do we get to a future that's more affordable and abundant? We accelerate housing growth. We recognize that people are the solution and not the problem, because if we don't, the scarcity conversation is already happening all over the state. Service cuts to things like hospitals, school consolidation, transportation, and that's a future that might lower costs in the short term, but has high consequential costs in the long term, and we need to be able to hold that future in mind. Thank you.
You know, it just occurred to me, so Kevin and I know each other socially, and we have these same conversations when we're just out to dinner together, and that either means we really believe in what we're talking about, we really care, or we're super boring. So I don't know which it is, Kevin, but we mean it. So Kevin laid a lot of the groundwork here, and I'm not going to be able to dive into all of the data that I usually like to dive into to sort of set the scene and make the case for what has happened in Vermont's housing market and what we need to do to change it. But what I'll say real quick is Kevin talks about this stagnation that we've seen in the last 20 years. And Vermont saw tremendous growth in housing, in households, population, demographics improved in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And then we started to see that tail off towards the end of the 90s. And when we go back and we ask ourselves why, what happened? Well, we were building a fair amount of homes in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and then in the 1980s, as a state and a lot of communities across the state started making intentional decisions to curb development with a lot of good intentions in many cases, but the specific intention of regulations, both zoning and state laws, were to curb development, slow down the building of homes. At the time, it was for, we were worried about what would happen to our state if we grew at an unprecedented rate. We know now that we went way too far, and now we've made Vermont inaccessible and exclusive. So what does that mean? That means that we need to take direct action, intentional action, to undo a lot of that. And that doesn't have to be careless, doesn't have to be blatant deregulation, it can be very targeted work. And I think we've started a lot of that here. So I'm gonna go through a few of those things. So what have we done? I see a couple of my colleagues here in the legislature, so you know we've all worked together to do a lot. During the pandemic and in the years following, for example, Vermont, more so than many other states, prioritized that federal funding, that excess of federal funding that we had, we prioritized that for housing much more than other states. So the number that you see here up on the screen, that $600 million between FY 21 and 26 went towards housing, I actually estimated low. Vermont Public, Carly Berlin, did an excellent piece recently where she went through the painstaking work of digging through lots of different data. It's actually close to $800 million that Vermont spent in housing generation during that period because we had this excess of federal funding and strong state funding. But what did that teach us? It taught us that even with way more money than we ever thought, did we ever think we could spend $800 million on housing in a handful of years? No. Even with that, it didn't solve the problem. So legislators and the administration and partners came together and said, what do we need to do? Well, we need to fundamentally rework some of our systems to make sure that when we invest in housing, it goes further. So we did, we innovated. We used this opportunity with this federal funding to innovate, to try new programs, try different approaches to funding and creating housing, such as investing in manufactured home, reinvesting in existing structures. There's a lot here that I could spend a lot of time talking about. I'm holding back. I'm not going to dive into the wonky Homes for All initiative, even though I want to. But what's more exciting, even though it's not as sexy, is a lot of the legislative action that was taken. Again, partnership between the legislature and the administration to reform some of our systems. So I'm going to dive into some of those. So I'm going to start with the HOME Act. By show of hands, who is familiar with or heard of the HOME Act? Oh, awesome. All right, I won't talk about it. No, I'm just kidding. So the first thing we did, the HOME Act of 2023, this was a conversation that had started for years that, look, we've got a patchwork of 250 plus municipalities with different zoning. And a lot of those municipalities don't have zoning, but hundreds of different jurisdictions with different zoning, some very restrictive and some more permissive. Well, the state said, look, this is the thing that most directly affects home building on the local level. So we need to open up the lanes. We can't allow municipalities to say where you have water and wastewater, it's a minimum 4-acre lot for a single family home. That's not very inclusive, and that's definitely not making good use of the millions of dollars of taxpayer investment in water and wastewater systems. So what we said was, look, we're going to put some guardrails around this, and now, statewide, your zoning will allow for more density. So this was the state stepping in and saying, we're going to standardize to some extent what zoning looks like, and we're going to say your zoning needs to be a little bit more permissive to housing. So this is the state telling municipalities, be more permissive. Well, municipalities said, okay, state, what about you? You've got some difficult regulations to navigate, and we've been talking about Act 250 since 1980. Act 250, while incredibly effective in some ways, also is a huge burden on development. It's a huge hurdle for housing, and we see it failing in a lot of ways. So there was broad agreement that we needed to update Act 250, and that's what was done in Act 181 in 2024. And in broad strokes, this was the state saying, all right, Act 250, which is the state's land use law, we're going to carve out some areas where we're going to relieve the jurisdiction of Act 250, and the municipalities who now have more permissive zoning, you are going to be able to oversee the land use regulation in your municipality. So Act 250 is going to go away in certain areas subject to certain maps that Taylor's going to talk about in a bit. And then in other areas where we know there are critical resources, we'll have a little bit more jurisdiction. So now this is the state stepping up and saying, all right, we're going to alleviate some of the pressures from our side of things. Now, all right, we're going to read this painstakingly word by word. No, I'm just kidding. I want to point out that there's another effort that's going on while this is all happening. And this is an effort to improve our data, our knowledge of what are our needs in housing, where are we going in housing, how do we track it. And in both the HOME Act and Act 181, the legislature, in partnership with VHFA, our team, the RPCs, worked together to create language around housing data, specifically taking our housing needs assessment. This is every 5 years we perform an assessment of what we think our housing needs will be in the next 5 years. And then we said, how can we leverage that analysis and take it a step further and not just look at what do we need to get by to make the housing market work? Could we set some targets to actually try to drive better demographic and population outcomes and actually steer outcomes in the way we want, not just play the victim? And so that's what the legislature did. They put in statute that, yeah, take that needs assessment to the next step. Establish targets, and then track them. So put a pin in that. We're going to come back to it. One final piece just recently. We spent a tremendous amount of money on housing, and in the analysis afterward, we found a lot of that funding didn't go into the unit itself. A lot of it went into the infrastructure, transportation infrastructure, water and wastewater infrastructure, because what we've done is we don't have municipalities that have the financial capacity to invest in that for the development and then allow the housing developers to come in and just build the housing. We've now put all that burden on the housing development. So what does that do to the cost of each unit? It drives it up. You're putting tremendous new fixed costs on housing development. So we were seeking a way to increase financing for infrastructure funding. And that's what was achieved with the Community and Housing Infrastructure Program, CHIP, which if this is as wonky a crowd as I think it is, I think many people here are probably familiar with CHIP. Do I see some familiar? Okay, good, nodding heads, that's fantastic. So what this is gonna do in essence is provide up to $200 million a year for the next 10 years in infrastructure. That can be transportation infrastructure, water and wastewater, anything that enables housing. So this was tremendous. So now let's come back to the housing data. Yes. The question was, what do we do with all this data? Well, we need to track it. So we've established very specific ways to not only go look back at what's been produced, but look in real time, how and where are we creating homes? This is now, I'm gonna transfer over to Taylor because the next stage of the regulatory process is where this is gonna be really important. All right, thank you all.
So as Commissioner Farrell said, the Home Act and Act 181 passed in the past few years in the legislature. And the two key things out of those pieces of legislation for the RPC, the Regional Planning Commission, was the establishment of these regional housing targets and the requirement of the regional planning commissions all across the state to do new regional future land use maps to better define those areas where we should focus investment in the future in bike and ped infrastructure, public transit, but also water and wastewater, and to also determine those areas where we should relax Act 250 jurisdiction. And so I'm going to talk about how we've done that in Chittenden County over the past year in the development of our regional plan. And so as Commissioner Farrell said, Act 181 is really about alignment, creating alignment between municipal planning, regional planning, and state planning. It's about modernizing Act 250 and modernizing the way that we invest in public infrastructure in our centers and areas that are appropriate for growth. And so regional planning commissions have regional plans, and two of the things we talk about in those regional plans are transportation and land use. And so Act 181 and the Home Act really lead into that. But I also want to just provide the context that we also have to think about 13 other goals and 9 other elements of our regional plan. So we have to think about things like public health that also link to transportation. We need to think about, Catherine, help me here. What else do we need to think about in a regional plan? We need to think about housing. We need to think about energy. We need to think about all these things that link to land use and to transportation. And so I just want to provide that context. We're thinking about Act 181, we're thinking about the Home Act, but we're also thinking about a lot of other things when we're putting together our regional plans. Regional future land use mapping isn't new. It's something that regional planning commissions have done for the past 50 years. And so right here you see the existing regional future land use map in Chittenden County. And so the only thing that's really changing with Act 181 is that we now have to use a standardized formula across the entire state. All regional planning commissions have to use the same 11 categories. And these are the categories. I will not take a lot of time to explain these 11 categories, but I want you to focus on the categories in the red box. There are 4 categories on the top, which are those areas that we want to grow in. It's our downtown centers, our village centers, our planned growth areas, and our village areas. These are areas where we generally have water and wastewater infrastructure, or at least one of those things, where we have public transit, where we have complete streets and walkability. And so I'm going to show you on the next map, or in 2 slides on our map, these areas in Chittenden County. This Act 181 framework also has these 4 categories feed into a revised state designation program. So are people familiar with the state downtown program, designated downtown program, village center program? So right now we have 5 state designations. That's now with Act 181 going to go down to 2 designations, just centers and neighborhoods. And instead of each municipality going to the state to get approval for these areas, now those areas are going to be defined on that regional future land use map. And so by right, when that regional future land use map is approved, those designations apply to the municipalities. Lastly, these 4 areas lead to potentially some level of Act 250 exemption in the future. There's Tier 1B, which is a partial exemption from Act 250, up to 49 units, new units of housing as a part of a project could be exempt if municipalities choose to opt into Tier 1B within these 4 areas as shown on the regional map. And then there's also a Tier 1A exemption, which is a full exemption from Act 250. There's a bunch of criteria that go along with that. But our map provides those areas that are eligible for that Tier 1A exemption. And then municipalities can choose to apply to the new State Land Use Review Board to pursue that full exemption from Act 250 to make it easier to build housing in those areas where we want to see housing. So in Chittenden County, the way we went about developing our map and figuring out how to achieve our housing targets is through a whole host of engagement over a few-year timeline. Our staff has hosted over 150 events over the past about a year-long process with our municipalities. A lot of those meetings have been focused with municipal select boards and planning commissions, but also we attended a whole lot of community events across Chittenden County. We also had a draft map up on a public-facing map viewer where we received comments from the public that helped shape the map I'm going to show you in a few different slides. I really want to highlight this because, Act 181 creates this ability for the region to create these new regional future land use maps, and that potentially could be really a top-down process. We really could be telling municipalities, hey, here's the map, you need to conform with this. But we've really tried to make it a bottom-up process as best we can. We really want to be collaborative with our municipalities in creating this map and deciding where these exemptions are. And we really think that's the intent of the legislation as well. There's a requirement in the legislation that we do meaningful engagement, and this is our attempt to do that here in Chittenden County. I haven't talked about transportation much so far, so here's my attempt to do that. In creating our new regional future land use map, we consider public transit routes and where we have multimodal infrastructure within the county. And so we went down street by street in some cases to figure out where we have access to sidewalks, to multi-use paths, in areas connected to centers. In creating our housing target and taking our regional housing target and disaggregating it down to the municipal level, we decided that we wanted to have 90% of our housing target focused on those areas that are planned for growth. That's pretty aggressive. In Chittenden County, we've been about 80+% of our housing has been areas planned for growth for the past 5 years, and so we wanted to up that and concentrate growth more in those areas where we have infrastructure. In terms of the transportation chapter of the plan itself, we haven't made many changes in the current draft of the plan. Our regional plan already includes our metropolitan transportation plan, which is very TDM focused. It already calls for doubling, tripling transit service, really focusing on bike ped infrastructure in the future. So there really hasn't been any policy changes so far in our draft plan. Here's our new regional future land use map. You can't really read it at this size and scale, but this map viewer is available on the CCRPC website. I will zero down a little bit closer or zoom in a little bit more here, and you'll see the blue areas on this screen are about a quarter-mile buffer from our existing transit service here in Chittenden County. And as you can see, those blue areas are very concentrated in Burlington, South Burlington, Essex Junction, Winooski, Williston. Our cities in those areas where we have a lot of housing. And so I just want to reiterate here that, the focus of where we want to grow, the focus of where we're going to have, or where we're going to achieve this new housing target is very much in areas where we have existing infrastructure. And so from our perspective, it's very much about trying to have more efficient use of that infrastructure or trying to build transit ridership in those areas where we already have transit service. Lastly, I'll talk about the housing targets. As Commissioner Farrell said, the statewide housing needs assessment created housing targets for each RPC for 2030 and 2050. There's a range, it's a pretty wide range for Chittenden County in 2050. And we're focusing on 2050 because we can do more about what happens in 2050 than 2030. That's right around the corner, that's like tomorrow. And so for Chittenden County, just know that the range is between about 15,000 units by 2050 and 47,000 units. 15,000 units represents pretty much doing what we've done over the past 20 years. 47,000 units is really solving homelessness, having a healthy vacancy rate, doing all we can. At the RPC, we've really focused on the mid-range, which is about 31,000 new housing units in Chittenden County by 2050. And CCRPC has had to take that 31,000 unit target and then disaggregate it to the municipalities. So municipalities are now required to take that target we give them and to put that into their municipal plan and then start planning themselves about how they're going to achieve that target. To do that, we divided our municipalities into 3 different categories: our cities, our rural towns, and our municipalities that are a mix of urban and rural. We assigned 60% of our regional housing targets, so 60% of that 31,000, to our 4 cities, places where we have infrastructure, where we have public transit service. Our rural towns, we gave them a very small percentage, only 3.8% of the regional housing target. We did that because those are places that don't have infrastructure, where we do want to focus growth in our villages, but it'll be a challenge. And then our mix of urban and rural municipalities, they receive the remainder, a little over 36%. These are places that do have some areas that have infrastructure, some areas that don't. And we used our regional future land use map and access to that infrastructure to kind of weight who got what percentage of the targets. I'm not going to show the targets today because they're still a work in progress, but there is a draft on the CCRPC website if you're interested. I do want to note that one thing we didn't do as a part of this regional plan update is update our regional transportation model. That's something that we're going to do in a few years. In 2028, that's when the Metropolitan Transportation Plan is due to expire. It's in that model update that will feed in the new regional future land use map, the new housing targets, and figure out if there are additional strategies that we need to add to our regional plan to ensure we address those targets or meet those targets in a way that doesn't negatively impact our transportation system. And speaking of transportation system, I'll kick it over to Matthew to talk about that.
Hi, good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. This feels like a great family reunion when we look around and see everybody every year getting together and talking about issues that matter. I would be remiss, Kevin started with a sports reference, and I'll start with a RuPaul's Drag Race reference, which is oftentimes in the roast, it's the hardest job to end a session because you, in many ways, have to sum up things and also bring your own touch to it. So I'm standing on the shoulders of giants, but here I am. I'm going to communicate something very dissatisfying to start off, which is the context matters about transportation. So really, it's all about you all, and we respond to that. So thank you. No. So you'll see the name of my presentation here is Vermont on and around the road. This was originally used for a conference in Colorado, so that is a reference to Jack Kerouac, as weak as it is, but here we are. So things to start off with. First and foremost, we have really great bones here. Like Myrna, I come from New York. I come from Long Island originally and then lived in the city. And just coming up here 4 years ago, I can say, wow, what is going on up here? This is a special planning context. And I should have a jar here that says context and put $1 in every time because you're going to hear me say that word a lot. Don't get bored with me. First and foremost, state statute saying that we need to maintain the historic settlement pattern of compact village and urban centers surrounded by a rural countryside. That's amazing. The idea in place already that we somehow want to provide some definition and structure to our land use. 3 emerging themes that we're certainly converging on in our various planning practitioner conversations. Smart growth, the reason we're here today and the overall theme of the conference. Resilience, certainly in light of climate change and the things that are happening to our infrastructure and our communities. Thinking about how we can still live where we are. And finally, equity, thinking about the communities that we're connected to and how we can continue to support and talk to one another. Coming from New York to Vermont, I learned a phrase that really didn't understand at first, but now I really do understand. It's a small state. That means that we all here today work together to make this happen. Regional planning commissions, the state government, private sector, municipalities, we all have a small part in all of this. And I think just to set the stage for my conversation, I want to give you where I'm going to be going, which is 2 main things. A plan informs context, again for the jar, which informs design, and that's specific to transportation, and so I'll elaborate on that a little bit more. And thinking about how within this it's a small state context, big and small connections come together. Who does the big things, who does the small things, and how are they coordinated, most importantly, to make a reality? Here's just an example, again, of the kind of what we're working with here in Vermont. So certainly stable communities that are facing change. I don't want to put a negative spin on it by talking about the climate change aspect of it, but again, these are major changes in terms of infrastructure, in terms of people coming to the state, and thinking about how all those people will be connected and move around is certainly of concern to the Agency of Transportation. So on the road, here we are. Now I'm going to tell you about what we do. I just want to start off with our agency motto, which I kind of read in the voice of George Costanza, like, we're working to get you there, we're working on it. We really are working on it. And our agency is composed of many different parts. And so we have a planning division, our highways division, which develops and implements our projects, our maintenance division, which maintains our infrastructure. And so all of those things work together. I work specifically in our planning division, and what that means is I focus on the creation of our statewide plans that provide access to federal funding sources, outreach processes, which also provide other access to federal planning and funding sources, and then much more from there. We have our hallmark program, which is called Transportation Planning Initiative, is our dispersal of federal funding directly to the regional planning commissions to provide transportation planning, context, and technical assistance to their constituent municipalities. That's a program that is renewed on an annual basis and provides funding for broad buckets of administrative activities, planning activities, and data collection activities. And it's adaptable on a yearly basis. And so that means that if we hear from you all that things are changing, we can change accordingly and think about how that enters into the context of planning. Apart from this kind of ongoing dialogue, we also create and help create visions. And so most notably, my colleague Faith Dahl is here today. She oversees our Better Connections program. That program is a partnership between VTrans, ACCD, and ANR that focuses on providing communities with the opportunity to, again, create a plan that gives us context that then can be incorporated into the design of transportation infrastructure. We've done some other studies apart from these kind of ongoing programs. So first, our 2021 Smart Growth Study, which focused, broadly speaking, on envisioning future growth scenarios by maintaining growth within existing places and seeing what the collateral benefits would be in terms of vehicle miles traveled, safety, and what have you. That's available online. I'm happy to provide a link. Our multimodal roadway guide, I'll talk more about, that's ongoing. Our update to our complete streets guidance, again, encouraging designers and practitioners to think holistically about roadway designs that focus on multiple users and not just vehicles. So again, this kind of iterative process of pulling things together and thinking about more diversified communities with multiple public transportation connection options, both in terms of public transportation itself, meaning buses, and then also the transportation spaces that we live in terms of sidewalks, bike paths, and what have you. And finally, Smart Growth America, we partnered with AARP to assess our Class 1 Town Highway program. For those of you who work in municipalities, you're aware of this, but essentially it's formula funding to municipalities that take over state highways to manage them as they see fit and design them accordingly. The multimodal roadway guidance. This is kind of where this is all going, and this is the link between our land use conversations and our transportation conversations. What you see right now is not Richmond, Randolph, Vermont, excuse me. And the line that you see going down this image has multiple colors on it. In terms of functional class, in terms of how the federal government and designers view this roadway right now, that is one continuous line of the same functional class. But you see it passes through wildly different contexts, from a highway, interstate, to kind of a transition zone, to a town center. And so what we're seeking to do is kind of turn that on its head from a prescriptive design standard across a roadway, regardless of the context, to instead say, well, maybe in terms of a town-village connector that goes to interstate, perhaps the user that should be prioritized is the vehicle. But as we move towards a town center, perhaps that's inverted, and we think about roadway and streetscape designs that privilege other multimodal users instead. And what I mean by that is cyclists, pedestrians, and public transit. And so in seeking to move in this direction, what we're saying is that what is the adjacent land use? How can that adjacent land use be responded to with transportation facilities? And what specific design facilities are appropriate? Is it appropriate to have a pedestrian island right by an interstate exit? Maybe, maybe not. Is there a sidewalk connection there? Perhaps. But, is it more appropriate perhaps to have a pedestrian island in a downtown center where there is a crossing between a post office and a nice bougie little hipster market? Absolutely, we love that. It's good to walk and be able to cross the street and feel okay. So that's kind of where we're going with the update to this multimodal roadway guidance. I pilfered a map from Taylor to kind of just kind of move to a transition here, and again, putting it back on the crowd and the overall kind of symbiotic nature of this conversation, which is what is the context that we can design for, and what are the forms that nest within that context. And so the future land use maps are incredibly important because we can begin to superimpose things like a tiramisu, which, by the way, is my favorite dessert. So you see here, this is Richford in Catherine's region, where we took the future land use maps and superimposed what would be potential design facilities within that. So you can see that our downtown roadway zone, our urban Main Street, is pegged to what would be the village center. Whereas, again, as you move beyond that, that would be different. Just thinking again about this superimposing, we're seeking to coordinate with our partners about that context. And I just want to close with, first to relax, and just kidding, I have one more for you, because that wasn't enough. Somebody asked me today, it was actually Commissioner Farrell, how I got here. I had the privilege to get here by walking because I live in Quarry Hill. And so just thinking about that, I'm not going to go over test the crowd on who got here by walking, what have you, but who would have liked to have walked here but couldn't because of missing connections? Anybody raise a hand here? See a lot, right? And so this is where the rubber meets the road, to use a transportation analogy, I'm sorry, as I'm wont to do. Big connections and little connections, right? So elsewhere in the world, New York, Long Island, one main roadway, you have to walk along it. Maybe there's a transportation facility, maybe not. And that's the orange line. What would have been if there weren't thoughtful connections that were made for my walk here today. Sorry, I'm almost there, Catherine. And then, so instead is the purple line, which is my walk here today. And you'll see the main difference here, not in terms of mileage, in terms of time, but in terms of quality of experience, to Myrna's point about that terrible people mover in Dulles. Is it nicer to walk along a main roadway, or is it nicer to stitch together transportation connections from a multimodal standpoint through small neighborhood connectors that can connect our main population generators and demand generators? And so we can move the big things into place as an agency, like the overpass at the highway interchange here. But if we don't have those little connections and our local partners thinking about how to stitch to those places, we won't get people there. And so this is where that partnership comes in. I just want to leave you with my walk here today because I think it's a good example of everything that we're seeking to do, which is stitching together communities based off of context and future land uses. So thank you very much.
Great, thank you. I'd like to thank our panelists for really talking about how Vermont is achieving some of these dreams that the Myrnovator had us thinking about this morning. We have time, we're gonna go a little over and just have time for one question, which I'd like to put to the panelists. We hear a lot about Vermonters concerned about affordability. And dreaming is great, but being able to afford to live here is even better. So if I was the average Vermonter, and not somebody who would come to a CATMA conference, but just an average Vermonter who said to you, yeah, that's all well and good, but isn't that going to cost too much money, and how do you expect taxpayers to pay for that? What would you say?
Okay, oh, it's on, look at that. I don't know why I would choose to take this question, but you know, I think it's a good question because a lot of our land use and a lot of what we're trying to shift development toward right now is making use of where we've already made these investments or where we're wanting to steer these investments. So when we talk about density and walkability, sometimes those words don't click with the public, but there's a reason we're pushing for that. Where we've already made the investment in walkable streets, where we've already made the investment in sidewalks, in biped, complete streets, water and wastewater. We're trying to steer more home building there so that we're leveraging what we already have to whatever extent possible. Will we have to expand it and build more? 100% yes. But if we're steering that investment to a concentrated area, it's more manageable, and we're spreading that cost around across more households.
I'll also hop in from an agency perspective, which is, and I'm not going to make this a therapy session, but driving on the Bell Parkway with my parents growing up and being frustrated that there was only one choice to get from where we were in Long Island to New Jersey, that idea of one choice, which is an expensive choice, a car, which comes with insurance, which comes with maintenance and upkeep. And so the idea of providing choice through infrastructure and through different types of infrastructure provides the opportunity for folks to move around differently. And so there's an inherent cost savings for families and communities with that idea of providing choice. Maybe once you have that pedestrian connection, you can opt for a car share as opposed to having your own personal vehicle. And I think that's where kind of hanging the hat on the conversation of choice is the approach I like to take in conversations like that.
Just on that choice point, I just want to, through all the engagement work we did in developing the regional plan, I mean, we heard a lot about transportation choice. And I think that's so important for people or to people. And I think that, there's opportunity to potentially reduce your own transportation costs when there is, greater access to choice.
Kevin, the anchor leg?
Thanks for the track analogy. So I would say to the average Vermonter that we are already paying for it, and it's becoming increasingly more difficult to pay for it because of our demographics. And this is why we need to have that vision of where do we want to go as a state, what is that future, and again, I mentioned towards affordability and abundance. We can either choose to have increased level of taxes and a smaller and smaller pool of people, or we can grow the number of taxpayers. I've heard the criticism that growing the population is going to make things more expensive because we don't have the carrying capacity. I would argue that actually we don't have the people capacity to carry the capacity we've already built. And many places around our state have actually experienced depopulation, and those are the towns that are struggling with those scarcity conversations, with threats of hospital and school closures. So just to maintain what we already have, right, we need to envision growth as part of that solution set, and if we can do that, it'll also be more affordable.
Great. Thank you very much for those thoughtful comments.